And over to you, Mike.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome. Today, as you introduced me, I am, well, Michael Macintyre is my name that I was given when I was born. My mother and my wife historically called me Mick. When I joined the military with a bunch of francophones, you can imagine that Mick is a little bit hard to say with a thick Quebecois accent. So a lot of people started calling me Meek, and rather than participating in their possibly mortal sin in misassigning me of that dubious virtue, Mac became sort of the easy one, or straight up Michael. So there is some confusion, but I always answer to just about anything. So a brief note about me as we begin. I did, as I mentioned before we went on camera, I was confirmed by Pastor John, who's here. I went through university with Pastor Kevin, who's listing there, and I studied at the feet of Aaron Phillips in terms of chaplaincy. I was ordained in 2010 to St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in Spruce Grove. In 2013, I was recruited into the Canadian Armed Forces as a chaplain. That was quite possibly the single best thing that I've done in terms of a career selection. It was a personality match for who I am as an individual, and in terms of the freedom that allows me to do things and the interactions that it has. So I want to thank Prima for asking me to come and present on military chaplaincy and what it looks like in terms of the context. So I'm going to click a couple buttons here, and I practice this, so we'll make sure that I can get it right again. Fire this up. That one. And click that one. There we go. I think everyone should be able to see that presentation now. So the dynamic of the Canadian Armed Forces is probably more familiar to people from TV or from the media. And if you're largely from the media of late, it's probably not exactly the best dynamic. I mean, certainly a lot of our troubles have been all over the media in the last little bit, but also mixed in with all of those is a bunch of things like my members who went on Op Laser, which was our domestic response to the COVID crisis and support. We know, looking west into the province of British Columbia, that we're going to be deploying there sometime quickly. I was posted here in Edmonton from 2016 to 2021. Just this past summer, I was promoted to the rank of lieutenant commander and posted to Ottawa, where I hold the position of being the staff officer to the chaplain general, which is a little like being the assistant to the bishop, with a little less holiness and a lot more technology. I wouldn't mind if those were inverted, but we can deal with what we have. It's an interesting experience being called into an institution such as the military, because it takes it out of context. When we're ordained into church work, we are ordained into an environment that has its own expectations, that has guidelines and expectations, and comes with its own language and its own toolbox. That is tremendous comfort and provides a very stabilizing influence in terms of our lives. Like, it took me probably 3 years out of parish ministry before I stopped conceiving of time in terms of season of the church, right? Like, oh, what do you know? It's November 28th. I guess we're blue now, right? Is this the start of the new year? Well, no, for everybody else in the environment I work in, it's a month before Christmas, or Christmas music has already started in some places, but that's just my house. I mean, I'm not even talking about work. What the military does is strip out all of those presuppositions, because we are called to federal government employment with all the challenges that goes along with that, including the bureaucracy and the concept of separation of church and state. Chaplaincy has a long, and military chaplaincy has a long and storied connection with the military, going back to St. Martin of Tours. Realistically, it goes back beyond that in a bunch of different civilizations and traditions for the role of priests as they related to preparing individuals or societies for wars or calamities or natural disasters. Where we play into our relationship in the Canadian Armed Forces is as essentially providing frontline religious, moral, spiritual resiliency and pastoral care. So trying to support members. It is not entirely unlike throwing someone who is drowning a Kisby ring, which is the little life-saving ring for those of you not in the Navy, and having them tell you that they don't need it because they're not actually drowning. It's like, no, you very rarely are. But if you don't believe in what I'm throwing you, that means I'm going to have to find a different way to get you to believe in it. So a lot of this ends up being talking about things that we know are deep and provide a framework for resiliency and for a healthy spirituality without telling people what we're actually giving them. Right? A little bit of St. Francis in there, right? Preach the gospel at all times, and if absolutely necessary, use words. So we do the best we can in that. We produce an actual fair amount of our own in-house publications between ourselves and most other NATO militaries. We talk a lot about spiritual fitness and resilience because, well, quite frankly, when we entered the long-term wars in Afghanistan and for the US in Afghanistan and Iraq, our rates of operational stress injuries, PTSD and related afflictions, moral injuries skyrocketed to rates that we haven't, realistically seen before. So as our rates of those and as the suicide rates of current serving and former serving members began to climb, militaries began to turn inwards and start to really ask themselves why this was happening and what piece was missing in that. There has always been a shadow war that develops along the same lines of effort as an actual armed conflict or peacekeeping operation or domestic operation, as we tend to call them. And I'll also say, if I toss out nomenclature or words that you're unfamiliar with, just make a note of it and ask at the end, and I'll happily disambiguate anything like that. But as we're looking through and trying to provide resources for members, we're left with a very real challenge of how do you define spirituality? How do you define religion to a culture that is reflective of the greater part of Canadian society? Everybody, we've all talked with people who said, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Okay, what does that mean and how do we pull that into it, right? Anybody can feel spiritual looking at a sunrise. Anybody can stand in a garage, but it doesn't make them a car. So how do we help people identify what it is that they need for the care of their own soul? We go and we do lots of different things, and that makes the military a very unique environment. In the context of church culture, right, we often value stability above anything else, right? People live in the same community, people attend the same church for 30 to 50 years, and that's what it is. Like the pastor that I followed at St. Matthew's had been there for 28 years. Wonderful long-term ministry, and it was tremendous. But in this context, the life and work of the military chaplain is profoundly itinerant. So internal posting changes, so moving from unit to unit on the same base, are usually every 2 to 3 years, and national postings between 3 to 7 years in each one of those locations. So that is also reflected in terms of the broader military culture as a whole. It is hugely itinerant unless you're a member usually of a specialized occupation that is tied to a particular base. So if you're a jet engine mechanic, you're probably going to work at Cold Lake where we have fighter jets, or you're going to work at Bagottville where we have fighter jets. You're not likely going to be posted to Edmonton where we have tanks. Right? Like those two skills don't really cross much. But what it makes is for a broken world within a broken world. As families try to make sense, as everybody else does, of what's going on in the world around them in that broader context, they're also trying to work out what's going on in their own families internally with postings and movements and expectations and deployments. So family stress is high, and we work with families to not just the members, but the entire family unit to offer support, counseling, and advice in hard times. Sometimes it's honestly working as a broker, right? Trying to come to a deal between a family or a member and a chain of command so that we can get that member deployed, maybe for a shorter period of time, or maybe to split a deployment with somebody else, but trying to work out the needs of the institution versus the needs of the individual. When we sign on to the Canadian Armed Forces, we take on an ethos that starts with the phrase service before self. And in doing so, we willingly give up several of our own civil rights. We give up our right to be able to post whatever we think on social media. You may have noticed occasionally some people get in a lot of trouble for posting whatever they'd like on social media. We can't do that. We also lose the right to our own self-determination, onto the point that we call unlimited liability. So unlimited liability. Limited liability is you see a car on fire, you have a choice whether or not you run towards it. Unlimited liability means that we don't. If we are ordered to go and do something, even if it includes a high risk of harm to ourselves, we will go and do it. That is a heavy burden for a lot of people to bear. Add into that, military members will usually spend between 90 to 280 days a year away from home, depending on their deployment cycle. And that includes chaplains like me. So in 2020, I spent most of my time at home, partly due to lockdown. In 2019, I spent 86 nights in my own bed. That was a long year between training and a 7.5-month deployment. I am tremendously thankful for my family who supports me and the fact that I probably have the best wife in NATO, who handles everything while I go away. And even in a case like this year, as I mentioned, I was posted this year, but due to the Ottawa housing market, we couldn't actually acquire housing there. So I took what's called an imposed restrictions posting. So my family lives back here in Edmonton, and I live in Ottawa, and I fly back here to visit them when I'm available to. All of those rhythms and movements means that we have to identify and help members understand that what they're experiencing is a vocation. And it's a vocation that is one in the truest sense, that the uniform doesn't always or doesn't easily come off. Members who leave the military often have a hard time trying to reintegrate back into civilian life, have a hard time trying to reintegrate back into a world that doesn't have the same degree of camaraderie or community that the military has. In the same way that when people leave a faith community, they experience a grieving process because we take it on, it becomes part of who we are. Working with them, various parts of the country in various ways we've done it. I've done 2 international tours, 2 domestic tours. I really understand the embodiment of true love has none greater than this, that a man should lay down his life for his friends. I've seen tremendous sacrifice, tremendous love shown between members who do what is a very odd job under very hard circumstances. So we move on to talk about pastoral care and resiliency. And like I said, often it's trying to help people understand that they actually have a soul or that they actually have spiritual needs. So I use a military question often. So what is the better rucksack? So I spent 4 years with the 3rd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. And they're a light infantry battalion, so we walked everywhere. But that also means that, like a turtle, we have to carry our house on our back. So I would step off often on an operation or an exercise, and bear in mind, I don't carry a gun, so I don't have the weight of that. I don't have the weight of the ammunition, everything else like that. But one time I weighed myself before we stepped off, and I weighed 361 pounds. I don't weigh that as well without it, but it meant my rucksack weighed about 110. That is a huge amount of weight to carry, and there's all different ways that you can carry it. So the picture that's on the slide is of 3 different styles. I've worn all of them. I have my preference out of them, but it's trying to help people understand that we have the need to address our own spiritual resiliency. That is what erodes first in people before their physical resiliency is eroded, before their mental health is eroded. Their spiritual resiliency, their spiritual health is almost always the first wound that opens. The word spiritual is one of those it's either really popular or really hated by people. You often hear it used synonymously with wellness in sort of modern nomenclature, right? You'll go to a wellness retreat and you'll do drumming or yoga or something like that. And those are absolutely fine and good. And if they feed someone's soul, 100%. But how do you promote something that has to be fully internalized in order to be useful? If you require external validation or external feeding to provide your resiliency, it's the same as, can you work out without going to a gym? Well, yes, there's all sorts of things you can do at home. How do you promote spirituality or spiritual resiliency when you can't go to church, or you can't go to a yoga retreat, or you can't do things? So it's trying to make connections for individual members for that. We talk about spirituality versus religion. So spirituality is the rucksack itself, that big backpack. Religion is what goes in it, right? It comes from a Latin word that means to bind. Every person has some form of spirituality, but how they express it varies greatly. So if you have that spirituality, but it's not loaded quite well, you sort of take everything and you stuff it down to the bottom, and you take a whole bunch of different ideas and maybe conflicting ideas and you drag them along. Well, all those ideas are going to be at conflict with each other, and it's going to result in an increase in personal stress or a decrease in your own capability and coping mechanisms. Spirituality is often used as a catchphrase simply to refer to things that make individuals happy in life. I had to listen to a commanding officer once talk about the important need for spirituality, and he phrased it in terms of, go find what makes you happy and do that. I was like, So I had to speak after him, and I had to find a way of very gently undoing what he just said, because it's like, sir, what's going to make a lot of your people happy is not sleeping outside in -20. But do you know what we're doing tonight? We're sleeping outside in -20. Let's not confuse what makes us happy with how we experience the divine. But spirituality is almost that overarching sense of meaning or purpose in life. So how do we inculcate that? How do we deal with that? Jordan Peterson, for many of his faults, said one thing that has stuck with me. And he said, the purpose of life is finding the largest burden you can bear and then bearing it. So what provides the ability for an individual to bear those burdens that they take on in life? And that's the interesting aspect of doing ministry in the military context, is people take on burdens that are far, far exceed what most other civilian occupations ever will. A friend of mine who works with the RCMP and I once said that we probably should be much more honest in our recruiting and just have people issue a little sheet of paper that says, hi, here's your operational stress injury. Just deal with that. It comes with a uniform. It's just going to happen. Make peace with that now, and it'll make your transition easier in life. Why? Well, because there's a huge, a much deeper aspect of anything that we see. We talk about military training, and always what everybody thinks of is these, uber fit, especially infanteers, going out and doing the business and wondering things, right? Which is awesome, and that is the tip of the iceberg. We developed a program called Sentinels, which was useful for encouraging and raising awareness for individual members, how to actually talk to each other. It's essentially a little course in basic attending skills, things that we forgot how to do the minute everybody got a cell phone and didn't actually have to talk to everybody face to face anymore. So it includes things like how to make eye contact, how to rephrase a question, how to reflect a question. But essentially, it's also about talking in terms of how deep or how complex life experiences are. So the emotional, cognitive, or spiritual effects of an individual's life are all those things that are deep within them. And what's interesting is, as I mentioned before, as the experience of people's erosion of resiliency happens in the opposite order of those bottom three. Persons can still remain in fantastic physical shape, but when their sense of meaning in life begins to be eroded, it's not long before their thoughts turn much darker or lose hope, lose the ability to construct what is a positive view of their life. And that inevitably affects their emotional health. And there leads a whole bunch of other problems, from mental health injuries to thoughts of suicide, to suicide ideations, straight up through to suicide attempts. Rather than leave the concept of resiliency purely in psychotherapeutic or morally therapeutic realms, we have to find ways and work to illustrate to members, to our military members, that they are ways that they can exercise their spirituality. So we come down often in terms of the military because, again, we are a government organization. Like more or not, we are civil servants in a fancy little green uniform or whatever color it is we're wearing at the time. So the government likes to double down on anything but talking about religion, which is very, very sticky in terms of the public sphere. How do we address that? How do we talk about it? So it's doubled down historically on talking purely about mental health, right? We're addressing solely on mental health without addressing crises of spirit. It doesn't actually address the root causes. Some things can, like brain chemistry is brain chemistry, and imbalance in those can lead to significant mental health problems. The gradual erosion of spiritual well-being that leads to crises of depression, well, that's a different experience altogether. We've had the military has done in the past, the temptation to treat existential crises, contradictions in value systems. It's also what we call a moral injury, or issues with regards to identity, worldview, purpose, or meaning, and reduce those to purely physiological or psychological terms. So I have a problem, or a member might come to me and talk to me and say, I have a problem, Padre, because when I was in Afghanistan, I saw Taliban members use 8-year-old boys to carry and bury IEDs because they knew that we wouldn't shoot them. Okay, that's a heavy thing to talk about. Let's honestly sit down and address what that was. You're watching an 8-year-old, somebody that we value very much here in Canadian society, bury something that has the capacity to inflict horrible injury or kill you and your friends. What do you do with that? How do you carry that? That becomes a deep spiritual wound. It's a conflict, a moral injury. How do you address your value system versus the environment in which you found yourself? Inversely, that member may go seek help from a psychotherapist who will then correctly, in most cases, diagnose and say, all right, you have a post-traumatic stress disorder due to your experiences on that tour. Here is the pharmaceutical solution to address many of the symptoms of what you're experiencing. Often we need to call individuals back to account for what is the cause. What is the root injury of that? Where does it start? Watching somebody's soul erode is a horrific experience. It is one of the hardest things I've ever had to experience. So we talk about resiliency as the capacity to adapt to, weather, and respond to stressors in life. It's interesting, over the last 18 months, as public discourse has gotten a little less respectful and a little less understanding of each other, in a lot of ways, I feel that what we've been witnessing is a return of, or is an erosion of individual or collective spiritual resilience. 20 months of stress has caused people's spirituality, people's soul to start to erode. And I think there are ways to bring that back. And I think there's ways to address that as it is. But often the starting point is simply, how do we connect with people who are doing different things in different places? So a little bit of things, this is all, one of the benefits of doing these presentations is I always get to show where I've been, and done fun things. So there's a helicopter that I was flying on, the second one that you can't see in that context. I was on the ship that's posted there, and I've ridden in those big labs there, but with that, that is emblematic of the actual life that we're called to do. Leaving home, leaving family, and carrying out the business is the reality of military life. And in short, military members leave all of those normative structures behind, right? To a certain extent, we carry a lot of kit with us, but everything else we leave behind us. We leave the stability of home, the stability of family, stability, in many cases, even of Canadian context and culture. So leaving is hard, and life on deployment doesn't mitigate any of those concerns. So we're left often as chaplains to be the sole mental health person that's deployed with a group of people, whether that's the military or on a ship, or whether that's the army or on a ship, or with an air group that's flying over different countries. So when you realize that we are often one person for every 500 members, you learn how to triage really, really, really quickly. At one point in time on my last tour, I found myself the only mental health expert, or the only chaplain, for 900 Canadians on 9 different duty stations in 4 separate countries. And that was in the Middle East. So travel was not necessarily easy. At the same time, I was always aware of how necessary what I did was. And what's interesting again about that is the context in which we find ourselves doing it in. It's really, really tempting sometimes to want to sermonize, right? We come from an experience of religion. We come from an experience of a very particular religion group in terms of our Christian experience. And often it's tempting to sit down when somebody is talking about an issue that they're having or a struggle that they're having, and you want to say, well, you know, there's this story about Jesus, right? You always want to throw the old sermon out there, right? But trying to get somebody to understand religion by whacking them with Jesus is like trying to get someone to like golf by hitting them with a 9-iron. It's not always going to work out quite the way you want to. So facilitating individuals' understanding from a profoundly incarnational perspective, that is the blessing of military chaplaincy. It is more than anything else a profoundly incarnational ministry, understanding that people experience the divine through you, not in terms of what you are saying, but simply in terms that you are being, that you are there with them. I'm the only person that doesn't carry a gun, which meant when I was traveling through Iraq was a little bit hair-raising from time to time. But it also was the starting point of a lot of amazing conversations with members who'd ask how I felt safe doing that, or how I came to terms with the fact that I was the unarmed person in the midst of them. Those same members that might not have an outward religion and are in desperate need of an understanding of their spiritual health or their spirituality, they'll often have some of the deepest expressions of faith that I've ever seen. But they have very little patience or time for church in general. So when we talk about spiritual resiliency, it ends up being trying to hit from 4 different directions. How do you address the mind? Guilt or feelings of inadequacy? There's not a single one of us that hasn't looked at a situation and wanted to be able to do more. How we deal with frustration or anger at life situations. If you have ever felt frustration at the federal government, imagine what it feels like to have to go where they tell you. It is an entirely different kind of experience. And how you deal with community. So I guess that's 3 things, not 4. Lack of direction, lack of boredom or listlessness. Again, what is that sense of meaning or purpose that you have? There's a great book, and I'll flip through the next few because I'm pontificating a little bit. If you're interested in a book, this Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers is a great resource to take a look at, because essentially it works on the concept that the perception of control reduces the stress of having no control. In short, spirituality, or a sense of connectedness to something that's bigger than yourself, can produce for you the understanding that at least you are playing a role in it, which is often simply the biggest part of making those connections with people. Is what is the sense of purpose or the sense of meaning when it doesn't seem like we have a lot of purpose or meaning, especially in one in the context where death is, in many cases, a present reality and that we have to deal with. Military doesn't necessarily have a cradle to grave care system. We certainly have a recruitment to grave care system if that's what's necessary. I don't think that I know many long-serving members who haven't attended a funeral for a friend. Whether or not that's been an operational funeral, or a member who's died on operations, or a member who's died by suicide, or simply a member who's died of complications due to work-related health or stress injuries. Walking through and being an emblem of that, like every so often, if you've ever heard stories about military chaplains, you've probably often heard that we carry candy everywhere we go. That is 100% true, because that is the simplest form of behavioral modification. I see somebody, I'm going to give them a candy. So they get a little bit of sugar and a little bit of happy, because other than that, they usually only see me or want to see me when something is going very, very bad. So simply understanding, and again, it goes back to that incarnational ministry. How do we live and work among them and understand our role in a way that doesn't sort of push ourselves onto them or push our agenda onto them? Because we're broadly reflective, or the military is reflective of Canadian society as a whole, we deal with, realistically, consumer culture all the time. So how do we speak into consumer culture and how it understands? The materialist presumption, right? Spiritual conditions can solely be treated as mental disorder, managed pharmaceutically or with therapy, right? There's still up. I've met professional therapists who regard religion as a crutch or religion as a negative in someone's life as a coping mechanism. People often talk around it. The US military often has the opposite problem, and they will simply force cultural Christianity down their members' throats. Again, refer back to my earlier comment about trying to get someone to like golf by hitting them with a 9-iron. It's not the most effective way of communicating the importance of religion or spirituality in people's life. One of the biggest roles that we have is simply a reminder in the midst of people to talk about spiritual health, because that's probably the most awkward aspect that people don't always want to talk about. We talk about mental health, we talk about physical health, we'll go to the gym, we talk about our gains. But how do you broach that topic outside of a church context? Well, that's always our struggle, and the balance that we work to try to facilitate people's understanding. And sometimes that's as simple as, maybe there's someone there to talk to you. Maybe there's someone there to talk to when you're just having a bad day. The benefit of this ministry is that we see members all the time. We see them at work, 8 to 10 unrestricted hours a day. If you're an officer, 8 to 16 hours a day. If you're on tour, you live, work, and play with the same people for 3 to 9 months. So you see them a lot. You have that opportunity, the incredible blessing to have those conversations at any point in time and always where they are. This is a window at Beechwood Memorial Cemetery in Ottawa, and it's actually our new cap badge that goes on our berets or on our headdress. What it simply symbolizes, I always look at it and reminded of there's an old setting for morning prayer. It was come and gather beneath the tree of life. I know that Prima and I probably sang that in seminary. I don't recall if I've ever done it in a congregational setting. And that's what it is. It is, how do we be a place where our members can come and find shelter and find solace, where they can find support and structure, and where they can find, in many ways, an unrestricted kind of love for them, solely that because we're there and that they're worth it. Because that self-worth is the starting point of people's spiritual identity and recovery. I think that's probably about enough on that presentation for right now. I just talked a little bit longer than I intended. My apologies, Prema.
Absolutely no apologies needed at all. That was a lot to take, to understand, to hear, and to hold. But I just wanted to open it to those present here. If you have any comments, any questions, any thoughts.
Wow, was that good? I love it. I answered all questions before they were asked.
Yeah, I'll make a comment here, Mick. I also volunteer as a chaplain for RCMP, and I thank you for your presentation. There are some similarities, I think, between the military and the police, and I think when it comes to these types of groups, the issues that you've mentioned, I think, are certainly issues that we'll find out in the general public. But what happens, I think, in military and RCMP and policing groups and so forth, and even other first responders, is that what happens is that some of these issues get sharply focused into short periods of time. And in some ways, I suppose that's a part of what they must adjust to. When they come to an accident, we might bump into an accident, well, not literally, but we might come upon an accident maybe once in our life or something like that. For them, it's coming into these very stark situations in a constant way, and it can barrage them with all sorts of stressors. And like you say, it pushes them into a place where they have to address their values, their moral certitude, their ideas of spirituality, meanings, purposes, and so forth, and even their place in the universe. And so it becomes, I think, as far as chaplaincy goes, a place where you kind of walk along with them, and you become almost in some ways, for some of them, a focal point to address those issues. And I just I guess invite you to comment on that.
No, I think that's a really good explanation, or a really good observation there, John. That is the focal point, especially. Like, as I tell most of my members, like, I am the one person, regardless of whatever rank I hold, that they can yell at in uniform. And it is 100% confidential. If they want to stand on my office and scream at people, they can stand on my office and scream at me. I really, I'm okay with that. You mentioned something is really good, right? Or a really good point. And it's when members start their serve members, whether it's RCMP or military, these are people who run towards danger, right? Repeatedly. Of course, firefighters and paramedics often do the same thing. But what I noticed, especially in my infanteers, and the same as I've noticed in my friends who have been police officers, is the first sign of a spiritual injury is the othering of people. So in terms of my police friends, it's that every drug dealer is just a terrible person. They deserve to be whatever. They deserve to be put away. And it's this minimizing and dehumanizing of them. In the course of my infanteers, certainly coming through Afghanistan, it was like all these Taliban should just be, it's like, we're doing, right? This is our job, right? We are professionals. We are in order to continue on. But the first sign of that eroding of identity for yourselves is the othering of somebody else based on a perception of it, right? And lumping everybody into the same group. Why? Well, because that produces an automatic emotional separation from us that we can stop caring about them, right? We don't really care about this individual who just died in a car accident because whatever, they were just a drunk or they were just living into whatever, as opposed to, this is a terrible tragedy. We can understand and give space for our own grief or understanding at the human cost of that, and let that percolate and understand in ourselves. Instead, there's a tendency among uniform members to other, ka-chunk, this group of people is here and I don't like them, so I don't care when I have to interact with them. Now I have emotional distance because they're just terrible. Right? Well, now we've just cut off somebody else's humanity. So 100% exactly that.
Thank you.
Kevin?
Yeah, one question I've been thinking about, and wondering if there's a conversation within the military between the connection between the military and nationalism. particularly how the military gets upheld as being like at the hockey game, for example. There's always a military person there next to the flag,
Yeah.
and how we reconcile that with especially your Christian vocation uh, as the chaplain there, as also living in these two worlds, the world of the God's kingdom and the world of the nationalism that's embedded into our military and vice versa. Do you think about this stuff, or how do you reconcile that stuff?
So we actually do think about it a fair bit. Draw a distinction often between nationalism and patriotism. Nationalism is a really, really not nice thing. And unfortunately, we collected a lot of it from the United States. The United States has a much stronger civic religion than we have. And if you're old enough to remember, they never used to have, in fact, military parades and fly past the football games. That's the legacy of George W. Bush when he didn't have an army big enough to invade Iraq. Unfortunately, here in Canada, it became very easy for Mr. Harper to adopt the same things. And if you think very much, and I'll speak very frankly, our rhetoric, even in terms of Remembrance Day, has changed. When I was growing up, our rhetoric in terms of Remembrance Day was, we remember the dead of the Great War, end of World War II in Korea, and our soldiers, and we remember those who gave their lives for the cause of peace. Well, within about probably starting 10 years ago, suddenly the rhetoric got changed and we're fighting for freedom. Well, okay, that's a US line. That's not our line. We went into the First World War because King George V asked us to. We went into the Second World War because the next George after that asked us to. Went into Korea because the UN asked us to. Went into Afghanistan because we signed a treaty called NATO. NATO has Article 5, which is an attack against one member is an attack against all. US invoked that particular treaty under, admittedly, somewhat spurious circumstances in 2001 after 9/11. That's where we went. That's what we're paid to do. The displays of the flag and of the military standing with them often is a little bit of a difference for us as opposed to how military members experience it. For most of the members that I deal with, it's a perk. It's a boon, it's an opportunity. Everybody hates being picked to be the person that stands at the game in uniform, right? Everybody's going to take free hockey tickets. That's fine. 99.9% of military members, like that's a tasking for us, right? Like when you are the guy or woman that's picked to stand up there beside the flag in uniform, like that is just a pain. Because now you have to get everything ready and you have to get yourself there and you have to get yourself out and you have to stay there. And you can't have any fun because again, you're in uniform and everybody's watching you. So even internally in the military, with the awareness of the former member of the Canadian Rangers that attempted to contact Mr. Trudeau in a very physical way last year, or the former member of one RCHA that was just sentenced in the United States for terrorism, 100%, it's a huge conversation that we have and that we have internally. Because it's wanting to understand that when we serve Canada, we talk about all Canadians, not just the ones that we think want to look like us, not just Europeans, not just, but for everybody for who we serve and understand. So it is a very obvious thing, right? Who do we serve? Well, I mean, the government of Canada pays me to do what I do, and the church equips me to do it. We have the ability as chaplains, and often do, to be the sober second thought. And we can stop, or at least put some brakes on the good idea ferry when it happens. But that conversation between nationalism is absolutely a huge one to ask and a huge one to consider. We are blessed in Canada that our military does not have the same civic importance or the same political importance that the US does. In the United States, the military is a political football. Everybody wants to carry it forward for a touchdown. That's why, sure, they'll pull it out of Afghanistan, which seems like you'd save a lot of money, pardon me, but increase military spending by a couple of $1 billion. Let me tell you, we do not have that problem in Canada. Nope. I think the last new truck I saw was new in 1984. So when I'm working on things that are just a couple of years younger than I am, that's, it's easier, I think, to view nationalism when you have overwhelming force. Patriotism is when you understand you're walking into most circumstances as an underdog. It was a very different experience as well for us when we were going into Afghanistan, because most of our roles, even in the Padre, when we were doing what we refer to euphemistically as kinetic operations, that was always the last step in a rule of engagement. The United States are very clear. If they feel threatened, they will fire. My soldiers had to wait basically until somebody died before they could fire. So we have a very different understanding of it that plays out in very different ways, but it's 100% a very good question to ask, and one that is absolutely talked about right up to the very highest levels of leadership in the Canadian Forces, well aware of the risk of that. It's a great question. Thank you, Kevin. I have successfully avoided, I might add, ever being the person in uniform at any kind of sports event, including once deliberately taking a duty call to avoid it.
Mick, thanks for everything. I don't have a question for you, more just a pondering now with the comment you made around spiritual injury, the first sign being othering people based on perception. It makes me wonder if the hatred, the vitriol between certain folks in the vaccinated versus anti-vax, or political polarity, I wonder how much of that is spiritual injury. So thanks for giving me something to think about. That's great.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, my comment was in the same direction as Aaron's. I had never looked at it that had it presented to me that way in terms of the spiritual, cognitive, mental, physical, and I can see it in my own life, and I can see how it would be just intensified so much in military life. So thank you for giving me that understanding.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. It is, and as I said, like, one of the challenges of it is, we're a gathering here of very highly educated, professionally employed individuals who are professionally religious for the most part. Now explain that to somebody who comes from West Burlap, Saskatchewan, whose experience of a church was the one they were baptized at and never set back foot in. Right? We're trying to explain often to somebody like you're hurting, you just don't see that you're hurting. You can't fix your soul by lifting heavy weights. Right? How do we reduce this? How do we bring it back? How do we walk it back to understand that that is the starting point of all of that? And it's a little bit like rust on your car. You see a little bit of it, right? Just that little bit of discoloration along the bottom of the door. And it's like, oh, well, that's probably not very good. And then, I don't know, suddenly you're driving down the Anthony Henday and your passenger door falls off. Like, you suddenly just went from a small annoyance to a significant problem in a big hurry.
Thank you so much, Mick, and thank you so much to everyone for joining and engaging in this dialogue. Thank you for that ministry that you are holding. Thank you so much for your presence there, for being away from family. You bring the face. You're a recognizable face for us that connects us to the military with so many that we might not even know. Your experiences are closer to our hearts because we know you.
Yeah.
And we can, through you, we can relate to the pains, the sufferings, and the hope, the strength, the resilience there as well. So thank you for that ministry. Thank you for being that witness and that presence there of that incarnational ministry that is so crucial and so needed, as much as you might be stretched from end to end. But
you're so welcome.
Sorry?
I said you're so welcome.
So we pray and we bless you for that continued ministry. We pray and we bless your soldiers who are ministering as they serve for the rest of us as well, and for all of humanity. We pray and hold all of you in your struggles, in your griefs that are visible, especially the ones that are not visible, and the losses that you continue to live so that we may have. So thank you so much for that.
I'm blessed by that. You're welcome.
And thank you all for joining us today, and blessings with you as you continue your day and your ministries in hearing and deciphering that within our own contexts and putting language to the ministries that we are called to do in our own context. So blessings as you are blessed and as you bless those you are called to serve. So God be with you, and thank you so much for joining in. Just a brief note that our next Synod Connect will be on December 13th, and we'll be meeting with the representative from LFEC. So thank you again so much, and God's peace be with you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Blessings.
Thanks, Meg. It was great.
You're very welcome.